Our next section of teachers are going to talk about countries of origin and push factors of immigration. And so we're going to start off with Mr. Paul Howard. Paul Howard is the 2018 Washington, D.C. Teacher of the Year. Let's give a welcome to Paul.
Why did you leave El Salvador? This is a question I've been asking around my school, trying to figure out what are the push factors. Why are Central Americans leaving their homes to come to the United States? And I had a student, for the sake of our discussion today, we're going to call him TJ. And this little 8-year-old TJ, what he told me is he came to the United States so that he could walk to school. And that seems like a silly answer. But if you understand the context around TJ's life, his answer makes a little bit more sense. So you gotta understand, TJ is from a rural part of El Salvador. All right, in this part of the country, the government struggles to curtail the gang violence that occurs. So oftentimes what parents do is they're gonna schedule and they're gonna organize escort services to get children safely to and from school. And this is the system that works, until one day it didn't. What happened to TJ is one day when TJ was on his way home from school, his escorts and himself were attacked by MS-13 members. They executed and robbed the adults in front of the children. They then turned the weapons to TJ and the other children, threatened their lives, but for whatever reason let them go. TJ's parents did what any parents would do. They are going to protect their child. They had to get him out. And the only family that they could send him to that was outside of the country were his aunt and his uncle in the United States. So yes, TJ came to the United States so that he could walk to school. Another story, we're going to call this girl AP. Now, AP had always planned to move to the United States. She just had to do so a little sooner. See, her parents were working in the United States to build up enough capital to send back to El Salvador to move the rest of the family along. And she was living a pretty good life in El Salvador. She lived in a rural community. They had gang violence, but the family was never a target of the gang violence until AP turned 10 years old. At which point a 15-year-old Marrero, which is a ranking member in the MS-13 gang, decided that he wanted her to be his girlfriend, which is a euphemism. He wanted to rape her. Her grandparents, who she was living with at the time, did what any grandparents would do, and they protected their granddaughter. They said, babe, you can't go outside. I'm sorry, you can't go to school. They're going to get you. And they protected her, despite the threats and the epitaphs being shouted through the doors and through the windows by the MS-13 members. They continued to protect their granddaughter until the threats were no longer threats. And one day they came in and they unloaded clips into the house. The grandparents did what any grandparents would do. They're going to protect their baby. So they sent her to the United States, where she was detained at a detention center. They heard her story, and they did not grant her asylum and sent her back. Grandparents did what grandparents do. They protected her. They sent her back to the United States, this time with their cousins. They were held in a detention center for 3 months before being sent to a group home in New York for an additional 3 months before finally being reunited with their parents. And that's the answer to the question as to why did they leave El Salvador. Now, my job as a history teacher isn't to tell these kids what their political opinions should be. It's not to tell them what their beliefs should be. My job is to provide them historical information that provides a context so they can understand their lives. So, if we're going to talk about the context of these two students' lives, we got to start at 1979. Now, you got to understand, El Salvadorian history goes way beyond 1979, but I only got 5 minutes to go over this, and I got to get going, so buckle up. So 1979, what you got to understand is El Salvador is under the dictatorship of a guy named Carlos Humberto Romero. Okay? Now, Romero is dealing with a growing insurgency of leftist, socialist guerrillas throughout the country. Okay? There's 5 different organizations that are fighting him. All right? We're going to put them over here on the left. Okay? Romero is using his military to fight brutally against these insurgents. Okay? And when I say brutal, we're talking murder, we're talking torture, we're talking rape, we're talking the worst of what could be a civil war. Now, in order to avoid all-out civil war, members of the military overthrew Romero to prevent full-blown civil war. Okay? And this is in 1979, Romero gets ousted. And in 1980, the democratic cooperation between the military and the civilians, the junta, is created. Okay? But at the same time, these 5 organizations that are leftist guerrillas are combining and organizing into what is called the FMLN, the Farabundo Mundi National Liberation Front, the FMLN. Now, the FMLN is being supported by the Nicaraguans, you following me? All right, and the Cubans. Okay, now the Cubans and the Nicaraguans are supported by the Soviet Union. Okay, so Soviet money is working its way to the FMLN. In the meantime, okay, this is a vacuum of power from a fallen dictator. It is not a peaceful transfer of power. And during this time, both sides are guilty of political assassinations, mass murdering of civilians, and it leads to the point that civilian participants in the junta government leave out of fear, turning it over to military control. Now, during this time, in the United States, under the Carter administration, the Carter was not going to continue to provide funding to the junta government because of its egregious acts by its military. Okay? However, when Ronald Reagan took office, the policy changed because you cannot let the Soviets win. However, he wasn't heartless. They did not want to support the brutality of the far-right, most extreme members of the El Salvadorian government. So they tried to support the more moderate Christian Democratic Party, the PDC. All right, so the United States is supporting the PDC. But the unintended consequence of it is when the United States got itself involved, it pushed the conservative members of the military further right, and they formed a separate party within the junta called the Nationalist Republican Alliance, better known as ARENA. Now, ARENA, for anybody who's heard of the Salvadorian death squads, you're referring to ARENA. Okay? Now, while the United States did not directly support ARENA, it supported the PDC, which did win the election and was the controlling party of the junta for a good long while. But the ARENA was controlling the military, and they had power. So the United States was, in fact, supporting the entire junta government, while indirectly the Soviets were supporting the FMLN. And now we're into 1981, and we're in full-scale civil fallout war. Okay? And we're talking, over the course of this 9-year official civil war, upwards of, and it's difficult when you're talking about mass graves to get a direct calculation, but we're talking upwards of 75,000 civilians are going to be murdered during this time period. Okay, we're talking mass rape, we're talking the murder of children by both sides, and I want to be very clear about that, by both sides. All the meanwhile, all right, the United States is accepting refugees from El Salvador during this time. These refugees are contributing to society. They still contribute to society. Their children are contributing to our society, and in some cases, their grandchildren are contributing to our society. But there was a small population that found themselves trapped in urban poverty in Los Angeles, and they turned to crime. And you know this group as MS-13. MS-13 then is arrested by United States police forces and exported back to El Salvador in the vacuum of the peace. Okay? The peace in El Salvador, the FMLN becomes an official party within the junta. But the country is devastated. Its economy has collapsed, its infrastructure is destroyed, its villages, its towns are shot. And in that, MS-13 has found the perfect environment to thrive and fill the void of human rights violations taking place in El Salvador. So there, TJ and AP, is the context of your history. It's the context of your lives. But the problem with that is this is big. This is macro history. History is more human than this. History is more human than this. And we've got to remember that. Because the whole point of understanding this context is to understand humans and how it's affecting humans right here, right now. That's the whole reason that we're teaching history. So just remember that. Context is important, and history's got to be human. Thank you.